Hello, welcome to our session on visual perception and visualization design. In this video, we are going to explore something that affects every chart, graph, and dashboard you will ever create, and this is how people actually see and understand visual information. Here is our roadmap for today. We will cover several key areas. First, the process to create data visualization. Think of this as your recipe before you start cooking. Then we will dive into how sight actually works. This is the mechanics of how our eyes and brains work together. Next, we will explore pre-attentive attributes. These are the visual features that grab attention instantly before you even consciously think about them. Next, we are going to talk about Gestalt Principles. These are rules discovered by German psychologists that explain how we naturally group and organize what we see. We will also examine which visual properties work best for different types of data. Then we will learn about data ink ratio, which is a powerful concept for keeping your visualization clean and effective. And finally, we will look at visual illusions, the tricks your brain can play, and how to avoid them in your design. Let me start with an uncomfortable truth. We are surrounded by bad visualizations. And this isn't just a beginner error. Even major news networks get it wrong. This example from Fox News has become almost legendary in data visualization circles as a cautionary tale. So from this pie chart, as you can see, the numbers add up to be more than 100%, right? So for pie chart, we all know you cannot be more than 100%. So there's definitely something wrong. So why does such errors happen? Think of this. Knowing how to use Microsoft Word doesn't make people a novelist. Knowing where the spell check button is doesn't mean that we understand grammar, story structure, or how to engage readers. The same is true for visualizations. Excel and Tableau are very powerful tools, but they're just that tools. They don't know if your data is correct. They don't know if a pie chart is the right choice. They can't tell us if the color schema will confuse colorblind viewers. As Stephen Few put it bluntly, even software vendors encourage poor designs. Why? Because flashy 3D effects and rainbow colors sell software, even if they make terrible visualizations. Jeffrey Hill, who is a leader in visualization research, echoes this. And he says software tools often lack a proper consideration of perception principles. So the bottom line here is that don't blame the software. Take responsibility for learning the grammar of visual design, just as you would learn grammar to write well. Here is the process that will save us from creating bad visualization. Think of these 6 steps as your quality control system. First, step 1, we need to set our goals. Before we touch the data, ask ourselves, what is the purpose? Are we trying to persuade someone, like in a presentation to executives? Or are you trying to create something for exploration, where users will interact and discover insights themselves? So these require very different approaches. It's like deciding whether you are building a billboard, which delivers a quick, impactful message, or you're building a map, which is detailed and exploratory. Then step 2 is to acquire the data. This is not always as simple as opening a file. You might need to research, submit requests, or get authorization. Data doesn't just appear. It often requires effort to obtain legally and ethically. Step 3 is to prepare the data. Here is where the reality hits. Data is almost never ready to use as is. You will need to integrate multiple sources, clean up errors, reorganize the structures, and often create new calculated variables. Think of raw data as groceries. We cannot serve them as a meal without washing, chopping, and combining. Step 4 here is to build the visualization. Now and only now do you open your software. Choose variables, select the chart types, apply the formatting, remove clutter. This is where design principles we will learn today come into play. Step 5 is to evaluate. This is a step most people skip, and it's a crucial step. So show your visualization to someone who wasn't involved in creating the visualization. Do they understand your message? Can they use the visualization as intended? A fresh pair of eyes can catch problems that you become blind to. Then step 6 is to use it. So finally, publish, deploy your visualization, and present it. But remember, this might generate feedback that sends you back to earlier steps. So notice something important here. The software shows up in step 4. The bulk of good visualization design happens in your head, not in the software. Now let's explore something fascinating, how vision actually works. Understanding this will explain why certain design choices are more effective and other choices may fail. So let's start with the mechanism of vision. So how is vision formed? What has to happen for us to be able to see? So here is an interesting fact. We don't just see with our eyes, we see with our brain. You can think of eyes as a camera, but it's the brain that does the heavy lifting. So the process of seeing starts with sensation in our eye. Light is the physical stimulus that triggers this sensation. So the light will come through either a light source such as the sun, a light bulb, your phone screen, or an object that reflects the light. The light will come into our eye, get translated into neural signals, and then sent to our brain to be processed. So here the optical nerve is the information highway that connects our eyes to the brain. And the optical nerve is a very high bandwidth medium to transport information. The signals can be passed with a speed as high as 100 megabytes per second. And if you compare this to our hearing, hearing can only process 100 bits per second. And if you compare the speed, you can see that's why vision is the primary source of input we get from our surroundings. So the neural signals are then transmitted and processed to form vision, which is internal representation in the brain of the external object. So the visual perception is a cognitive process comparing to the sensation, which can be seen as a physical process. The visual perception takes place in the brain, and they generate the internal representation. So during this process, the brain takes shortcuts or uses heuristics to create an image that is consistent with our past experience. So in other words, the internal representation reflects the external object, but it is not the actual object. So this is why what we see is not always the accurate reflection of the real world. So this is opportunity for visual design to influence the internal representation by highlighting important aspects and directing users' attention. So in other words, the human perception can be guided and augmented by visual prompts. So there is a simplified diagram of the structure of the eye. The eye is covered by cornea, which is a protective layer. Inside the cornea, there is a muscle called iris, and then the iris contracts and expands to enlarge or reduce the pupil, which is the opening of the eye. The pupil controls how much light is let in the eye. So in dim light, the pupil enlarges, and in bright light, the pupil will narrow. The right amount of light is needed to form a clear image, and behind the iris is a lens. So our lens thinks to focus the light onto an inner bag of our eyes, which is called the retina. And the vision problems such as nearsightedness, farsightedness are created when light cannot be properly focused on the retina. So many nerve cells are coated on the surface of this retina. There are two types of nerve cells, and they are rods and cones. The rods receive light in black and white and works best in dim lights. The cones receive light in colors and work best in brighter lights. The cones are the reason that we can see colors. And humans have three types of cones, which allows us to see color red, green, and blue. So the rods and the cones translate lights into electrical chemical signals, and these signals are then transported to the brain through the optical nerves. So in the center of the retina, there's a small area called the fovea, and this has a large number of densely packed cones. The vision in this fovea has the highest clarity of the retina vision world. So when we need to see the fine details, we need to fix our eyes in this small area to ensure that light is focused to the fovea. Human vision is trichromatic. We have three types of cones: red, green, and blue. But here is the catch. They're not evenly distributed. The ratio is roughly 40 to 20 to 1 for red, green, and blue. And this uneven distribution leads to color deficiency, and it's far more common than most designers realize. So 8% of male have some forms of color deficiency, and 1% of female have it. This means that in a room of 25 people, statistically speaking, 1 or 2 probably see colors differently than everybody else do. So here is a real-world impact. Red-green color blindness is the most common type. So this leads to an important design rule. You should never use color hue alone to encode critical information. We should always pair it with another attribute, like the shape or pattern or labels. When visual information enters our brain, it flows through three types of memory. So understanding this explains why some visualization work and some others overwhelm. Iconic memory is like your brain's clipboard, which is a temporary buffer where images land first. It's incredibly fast, but lasts only a fraction of a second. This is where pre-attentive processing happens. It's automatic, unconscious pattern recognition that occurs before you are even aware that you are seeing something. So iconic memory is like split second where a camera flash goes off. You can see the image burn into your vision briefly, but it fades very fast. Then working memory. So working memory is where conscious thinking happens. But here is the critical limitation. It can only hold about 5 to 9 chunks of information at once. And this is Miller's famous magical number 7, plus or minus 2. For visual information specifically, you can handle about 3 to 4 chunks. This is why overwhelming dashboards fail. They exceed working memory capacity. If your visualization has 15 different data series, colors, and legends, you are asking for the impossible. Please simplify your visualization. Long-term memory is the permanent storage, but getting information there requires meaningful connection. The key insight here is that chunking matters. If you can organize information into meaningful patterns, each pattern becomes one chunk, and this will allow you to convey information more effectively within memory limits. So, two influential researchers give us framework for understanding visualization. Ware describes 3 stages of how we process visuals. First is feature finding, detecting basic elements like colors, shapes, and positions. Second one is pattern detecting. Here we recognize relationships and groupings. The third is counting, so understanding quantities and making comparisons here. In the meantime, Burton describes 3 levels of reading a visualization. The elementary level is identifying a single value, like asking what was sales in March. The intermediate level is finding relationships between values, like asking, how did Q1 compare to Q2? The global, or also called the Gestalt level, is seeing the overall patterns. So this is like asking, what is a trend? Different chart types support different reading levels. A table is great for elementary level, and this is very easy for people to find specific values. A scatter plot excels at global reading. This allows people to see the overall patterns and relationships. So here's a design question that we should always ask ourselves. What level of reading does my audience need? And once you ask that question, then you can choose appropriate chart type to support it. Now we arrive at one of the most powerful concepts in visualization design, pre-attentive attributes. These are our secret weapons for directing attention and making patterns visible instantly. Before I talk about the concepts, here is a quick exercise. So looking at this slide, I would like you to think of this question. How many times do you see digital 7 appear in these numbers? Go ahead. You can try to count them or guess them. So that felt slow and tedious, right? You have to examine every number consciously, one by one, to see if you see a 7. And this is called attentive processing. It's deliberate, sequential, effortful, and slow. Now, let me give you a different illustration, a second version. Now tell me, how many 7s do you see? So the answer jumps out almost instantly, doesn't it? So here, the 7s are highlighted using a different color, so they pop out without effort. And this is called pre-attentive processing. This is automatic, unconscious, and nearly instantaneous. It happens in about 200 milliseconds. This is even before you are consciously aware of it. So the same effects on this slide. Here we have a larger 7 compared to all the other numbers, and they are even highlighted. And those larger 7s pop out from the background of smaller numbers. And this is also the power that you want to harness. When you use pre-attentive attributes effectively, the important information doesn't need to be found. It pops out. So let's catalog the pre-attentive attributes you can use. Colors have 3 components. The hue is the actual color, red, blue, green, and different hue pops out from each other. Then the intensity and lightness is how light or dark a color is. So light object pops from dark backgrounds. And saturation is how vivid versus gray a color is. Interestingly, saturation is not a strong pre-attentive attribute, and there's differences in saturations don't really pop out as easily. So also, their two-dimensional position is incredibly powerful. Objects in different spatial positions are instantly distinguishable. This is why scatter plot works so well. Position alone carries enormous information. So let's keep talking about pre-attentive attributes. So form attributes include the length, the width, orientation, size, enclosure, and shape. So longer items pop out from shorter ones. Thicker lines will stand out from the thin ones. Then a tilted line pops out from the horizontal ones, and a larger object captures information, and items inside a boundary stands out, and also circles pop out from squares. Each Each of these can make important data points jump off the screen without the viewer searching for them consciously. So here is a tip. You can combine multiple pre-attentive attributes for even stronger effects. So important data points might be both larger and different color. So here's a summary showing the same task, which is making 7 pop out, achieved through different pre-attentive attributes. Color makes it pop, size makes it pop, orientation makes it pop, texture also makes it pop. And each work independently, and you choose based on what other encoding your visualization already uses. When you choose colors, you are not picking from infinite options. Practically, we can distinguish about 290 surface colors reliably. For hue harmony, for color schemes, we should use a color wheel. So complementary colors sit opposite each other and create high contrast. The analogous colors sit next to each other and feel smooth and cohesive. And the triad colors form a triangle and provide balanced variety. But color also carry culture baggage. Red might mean danger in one culture or prosperity in another culture. Green suggests go and environmental in Western context, but it has different meanings in other areas of the world. Some general guidelines of color utilization are summarized here. First, color design must take a user-centered approach, so the cultural connotation is considered. Second, keep in mind of the significant percentage of color blindness in the population. Third, use color sparsely and purposefully. A rainbow might be very attractive, but there is no focus. The fourth, use the same plot throughout all the visualizations of the same application. If you need to use multiple charts for the visualization, stick with consistent color coding to eliminate the cognitive burden on the user side. Gestalt is the name of the school of German psychologists in the 1920s. Their research findings on human perception have a profound impact on visualization. So let's take a look at the principles they discovered. First is the principle of proximity. We perceive objects closer to each other belong to the same group. In the top picture, we see 3 groups of disks instead of 9 individual disks or any other grouping. From the bottom picture, we see 4 rows of small squares on the left, but then 4 columns of small squares on the right. So we can use this principle to group visual objects that we want the user to view together. We can also use it to guide the direction the user reads the visualization. Second, principle of enclosure. The 2 sets of small bubbles look quite different at the first glance, even though they are identical if you ignore the circle and the shaded oval. So we perceive the bubble inside the boundaries as the same group. So different grouping make the 2 pictures look quite different. Enclosure is a stronger principle that overrides proximity. The third principle of similarity. So similar objects are perceived to belong to each other. The similarity could be color, size, shape, or orientation. So the bottom picture is an example of applying this principle in visualization. So different shapes of the marks represent different products. So use the same encoding in the sales and profit charts, make it easier for the users to interpret the charts. Next principle is the principle of closure. Our brain makes up the missing parts of incomplete shapes. So instead of seeing 2 angle lines on the left of the top chart, we see a rectangle. The bottom chart showing the application of this principle. So not all 4 borders are needed to define the boundaries of the column chart. You can remove the top and right border. Next is the principle of connection. Objects connected to each other are perceived to belong to the same group. and this is a very strong principle that overrides proximity or similarity. There are more Gestalt principles than we just covered. We use them intuitively already in our daily life. Now that we have gained awareness of these principles, let's use them consciously to enhance the effectiveness of the visual design. The pre-attentive attributes, position, length, shape, color, size, and so on, are properties of data marks such as circles, rectangles, lines, etc., used in visualizations. Researchers found that different properties have different levels of effectiveness in data representation, and the effectiveness varies based on the type of data represented. So two-dimensional position is by far the most important attribute across all types of data. This graph shows how position of the bars encodes information of two dimensions and one measure. Year is a dimension where this value has intrinsic order. By positioning the two groups of bars following the order of the years, the order information is encoded in the position of the four groups. Another dimension is customer segment, which contains three values: home office, corporate, and consumer. There's no particular order of these values. However, by placing the same segment at the same location in all the years groups, this dimension is also encoded into positions. Finally, the lengths of the bar are encoded to be proportional to the value of the profit measures. In other words, the position of the end of the bar represents the profit values. We know that there are two types of data, dimension and measure. Dimension can be further divided into nominal and ordinal values. The effects of data mark property varies across these data types. Position is the best for all three types of data, but other properties perform differently for different types of data. For example, color hue is one of the bottom choices to represent measures, but color saturation can be quite effective to represent orders. So now focus on the property for numerical or quantitative data representation. Only length is preferred to angle or area. So let's illustrate these examples. Let's take a look at the two circles on the slide. Can you tell how many times the area of the big circle is that of the small one? In other words, what is the ratio of the area of the two circles? You can write down the number you guessed. Now, take a look at the two bars. Can you guess how many times the area of the longer bar is of that the shorter ones? What is the ratio? You can write down the number also. So, let's review. The answer is the same, 7 times for both examples. Did you find it harder to gauge the number for the circles than for the bars? So with circles, you have to compare and assess the area of the two circles. With bars, you can focus on the length only. Let's take a look at the research result again. So length is ranked much higher than area for effectiveness. This is why bar graphs are preferred to represent a number of relationships, and pie charts are generally discouraged since angles and areas are not as effective. Here you can see that volume is even more difficult to perceive than area. Therefore, three-dimensional charts should be avoided in general. Another visual design guideline is to keep the visualization simple by removing clutters and highlighting important components. This is best described as maximizing the date-ink ratio. So let's start by categorizing components used in visualization. The essential components are data marks such as bars, lines, points, and elements such as axes. These are called primary components. They are so important that missing some of them will lead to incorrect or missing information. Other elements such as borders, grid lines, legends, etc. have secondary importance. They are usually used to enhance the visualization and are referred to as supporting elements. So in visual design, supporting elements should never take the leading role and distract the user's attention from the data elements. The primary and supporting elements as data ink and non-data ink. Data ink is components directly describing the data. They are essential and indispensable. Non-data ink is a component that enhance or decorate the visual display of the data. They are not essential, but a proper use of them can help with understanding. So, maximize the data ink ratio is a golden rule in visual design. Here's the example of a line chart before and after data ink ratio is maximized. So you can see how much cleaner the chart on the right is compared to the chart on the left without missing any important information. So finally, let's talk about data illusion. Human perceptions are so powerful, but there are limitations. The physical and cognitive process to form the internal representation of external objects sometimes can go wrong and give us visual illusions. There are over 200 known visual illusions that can distort the reality and needs to be managed in visual design. So this slide shows how context can affect visual perception. Let's look at the first picture. Now we have two red bars, A and B. Do you get the impression that A is longer than B? That is wrong. They are of the same length. So bar A on the top appears to be longer because of the depth effect of the railway extending from us. The inaccurate internal representation is called a Pontryagin illusion. This is also the case when our perception deals with color hues or intensity. So in visual design, we should prevent context from inferring the message that we try to communicate. So here's a picture of meteor crater in Arizona. When the picture rotates 180 degrees, the dent on the ground becomes a hill. This is because we expect light sources coming from the top. And in this example, do you see the shimmer when you stare at the image? And this is caused by the tightly cluttered thin stripes. The shimmering effects become even more obvious when another grid with a slightly different angle is placed on top. This is called the Moore effect, and it tires the viewer reading the picture for an extended period of time. Now let's look at this example. So on the left chart, it's a very dense grid line with strong color intensity getting in the way of reading the data lines. To the right, by spacing the grid lines wider and toning down the color intensity, now the Morris effect is eliminated. The chart is a lot easier to read. The chart on the right also has a higher data ink ratio, so maximizing data ink ratio prevents some visual illusion. On this slide, do you see the black dots dancing in between the squares? This distracting effect is caused by the after effect when our eye moves around the grid, and this is called the Herman effect. It can also be observed on the unit graph on the right as well. So in this video, we talked about the process to create a data visualization. We explained how images are formed through a visualization process, which include a physical and a cognitive process using our eyes and brains. So visual design can leverage the understanding of this process to deliver the intended message effectively. We can also use pre-attentive attributes to attract users' attention and guide their focus. We can organize visual elements to properly utilize the working memory. We also introduce the Gestalt Principles to learn the rules of visual perception. We extended research results on the effectiveness of properties of visual elements, which explained by bar charts are more frequently used and pie charts are generally discouraged. We learned the overall rule of data ink ratio maximized in visual design. Finally, we see that our brain can play tricks on us and create visual illusion. So we need to be careful in visual design to ensure that we are communicating the accurate story. So thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video.